very excited to introduce Julia da Silva today. I've had the pleasure of working her across multiple projects here at the National Arboretum, but Julia is the Interpretive Specialist for the Arboretum, where she helps visitors make meaningful connections with the plant world. She's got a BA from Boston University and an MA from Tufts, where she studied American history and museum education, and has spent the last decade working in public gardens. She's a big fan of running, her cat Mary, and Eastern redbuds. So I'm very much like Julia in this regard, but despite all her colleagues' valiant efforts, she still remains a hapless gardener, and I'm right there with you, Julia. So hopefully we'll make some progress in that in the future. Okay, we're very grateful that you've chosen to spend some time with us today and share your research with our members and the Arboretum team. And with that, I will hand it off to you, Julia da Silva.
Great, thank you so much, Craven. Yeah, maybe the next decade of my public horticultural career, I'll learn how to keep plants alive. But for now, I'm going to start out by telling y'all about the work that I've been doing recently, which is a historical project about the CCC conservation camp that was at the National Arboretum from November of 1934 through December of 1941. This has really become a passion project of mine, and I'm really grateful for FONA's investment in this project and for all of y'all's interest in learning more about it. I think that Craven has told you enough about me, so I'm just going to get started here. To start us off, I want to briefly run through what we're going to be talking about. I had to leave a lot on the cutting room floor when I prepared this presentation, which is always really painful to my historian's heart. So if there's something you're curious about that I don't address, drop your questions in the chat. Craven will be collecting them, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can during the Q&A at the end. Also, just consider this a little taste for the full exhibition coming soon. So we'll get started. First, I want to start out with a little bit of context to get us oriented. On March 4th, 1927, President Calvin Coolidge signs the Congressional Act establishing the National Arboretum for the purposes of research and education concerning tree and plant life. The act was the culmination of many years' effort by an assortment of boosters from both the nursery industry and Washington's movers and shakers, including Frederick A. Delano, uncle of the future president, and city planning enthusiast, who at some point or another seems to have served on every sort of advisory committee this city has ever devised. Those original little F friends of the National Arboretum were filled with grand visions for a vast arboretum in those earliest days. But by the end of 1932, there was a general sense that the Arboretum was stuck, spinning its wheels. The director of planning for the National Capital Park and Planning Commission presented the Arboretum's advisory council with a report fretting about what he called the sorry state of the Arboretum. Delano, who chaired that committee and would serve on it till I think the 50s, concluded wearily that the National Arboretum was still as yet not functioning as a shrub and tree laboratory. So what was the problem? The issue, as it usually was, is money. In this next slide, there we go. Although the Arboretum was established in March of 27, Congress didn't appropriate any money for it until December. And when they did, it was $300,000, which was less than the $500,000 they'd hoped for. There were restrictions on how much over the assessed value of a property USDA was allowed to pay. Because all of this property they had to buy. None of it belonged to the government. So at USDA, the Arboretum project fell under the purview of the Bureau of Plant Industry, where the botanist, Frederick Colville, and assistant botanist, Oliver Freeman, are quickly tasked with its management, which at this point isn't much beyond land acquisition. So the decision is made to devote essentially all of the funds to land and to keep staff salaries on other payrolls. Because there's a lot of land to buy, the department has already determined pretty well what properties it wants, give or take some marshland along the Anacostia that we're not sure if we're going to reclaim it or not. So once the money comes in, Colville and team get to work. Some landowners were agreeable and others were less so. And the spending cap that Congress imposed quickly came back to bite Coville and his team in their behind when multiple owners held out for higher prices, and Congress struggled to get its act together to make that feasible for multiple years. So in 1927, you've got the money come established. By 29, you've got 190 or so acres. By 1993, you've got 190 or so acres. It was this strange kind of bottom left zigzag from like Mount Hamilton kind of up to what's Scatelli now. So it wasn't even really navigable. There were no real roads or bridges that connect the property in any meaningful way. They're hesitant to start planting too much because they can't really afford to. And they also want to keep the material safe. There's no guards, there's fences. Coville is worried about rewarding the adventurous criminal with the privacy to steal and do whatever he likes. So by 1933, the only development here is a small nursery plot, which is actually still in use, that was planted in 1932. The rest of the acreage is in no better and often worse shape than when we bought it because it's just been sitting, getting overgrown. Another 78 acres are tied up in legal wranglings and they're completely untouched. And then there's another 150 acres, 15 acres we'd like to buy, but we don't have the money for it. So that's it. There's one nursery, nothing else. Delano is absolutely right. The Arboretum is not yet functioning as a tree and shrub nursery. But 1993 is the year the Arboretum's fortunes shift, because in March of that year, President Roosevelt signs an act for the relief of unemployment, which created the Emergency Conservation Work, which we know better today as the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, which was the name the agency officially received in 1937, but it was popularly called that from early on. So I'm just going to kind of use that term indiscriminately today. In addition to creating the CCC, the act was one of several which empowered the president to redirect federal monies. So following the request of the Secretary of Agriculture and apparently the pestering of his uncle, President Roosevelt issued an executive order in October redirecting the funds necessary to resolve the whole land purchase debacle. They immediately start moving on getting all the real estate wrapped up. It'll take some time before everything is complete, but because of course it will. But this infusion gives the Arboretum the momentum it needs to finally get over this initial hurdle. So now it's finally time to ask the question, what do we do with all of this land? Because we still don't have staff, remember? Coville's been working this problem from a number of angles though, and is, like his colleagues across the government, exploring of various employment opportunities opened by the New Deal's various alphabet agencies that were trying to find work for unemployed Americans at all sorts of different income levels. From the short-lived Civil Works Administration, he and Freeman employed day laborers on basic clearing tasks. They tried that really early. The men they generally found unimpressive and undisciplined. That experiment was a dud. The CWA's parent agency, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA, you can see why they're the alphabet agencies, also had a division which was dedicated to opportunities for out-of-work professional women. And they employed a number of typists through that program for a number of years. So far as I can tell, those typists worked out quite well. And by the time Roosevelt gives them the money in October of 33, Coville and others at the Bureau have already been coordinating for a couple of months with the Office of National Parks to essentially share a CCC company that will be coming to the district. So the Office of National Parks oversees a number of camps in the DC area to work primarily on the circle forts that were part of the city's defenses during the Civil War, but also elsewhere. And so there was a company assigned to Fort DuPont east of the river, south of Benning Road, and that was Camp NP7. And we had an arrangement where we would get about half of the enrollees at that camp come to the Arboretum to work every day. And that proved to be very successful very quickly. Oops, I'm flashing forward too soon. Sorry. That work starts in November of 33, and the first priority is roads. There were a few dirt roads and driveways on the property, but again, they didn't intersect where we needed to go. So a system of packed cinder roads, truck trails in CCC parlance was important. But as you can see, calling a lot of the early work road building might be understating the problem a bit when the road building involves felling trees entirely by hand. Coville and Freeman quickly, though, conclude that working with CCC labor is a much more positive experience than the one they had with the CWA. And by mid-January, Coville is trying to get a camp established at the Arboretum itself. He also hopes that he can hang on to the 80 guys he has from Fort DuPont. Ultimately, he doesn't get to keep that Fort DuPont contingent. Company 288 will leave after a year. But their last project was constructing a new camp near the southeastern corner of the Arboretum property, near the intended M Street entrance. And that was called Camp NA1. Camp NA1 was constructed in the spot that is now the Grove. That flattish expanse between the M Street parking lot and the meadow, that's because of NA1. That area was graded significantly in order to accommodate the camp. Company 1360 was reassigned from a state park project in Williamsburg, Virginia, and relocated along with their Army Reserve Company commanding officers here to DC. On November 1st, 1934, the company officially moved into its new accommodations, and on November 5th, they had their first workday. Life in a CCC camp was handled by the War Department, which was one of the 4 departments, along with Interior, Ag, and Labor, that cooperatively assisted in managing the CCC. Every camp was commanded by a reserve officer assisted by 1 or 2 subalterns. It was the Army's responsibility to shelter, clothe, and tend to the physical, spiritual, moral, and intellectual well-being of the enrollees. They also enforced discipline. Despite what things might sound like, though, CCC camps were explicitly civilian, and enrollees were not expected to maintain anything like military discipline. While on the work site, the enrollees reported to employees of the technical services, the agencies in the departments of Interior and Agriculture that did the conservation work the CCC was designed to aid. For various bureaucratic and technical reasons that I haven't entirely untangled, but which are fortunately not relevant to today's discussion, first, the National Park Service, and from April 1936 onward, the Forest Service acted as essentially the Arboretum's, you could call them the subcontractor, standing in for the still technically staffless Arboretum agency. Nearly all of the same individuals, however, are here for the entire duration. Army leadership was also fairly stable, with about 4, perhaps 5 COs over the years. So you're a member of Company 1360. What's your day like? The schedule varied from camp to camp, but you probably woke up around 6 a.m. You might get an extra half hour to sleep on the weekends, and you might get up to stay an extra hour late. The men worked a standard 40-hour week. Truly inclement weather would keep them from work, but if work could be done in the rain or the snow or what have you, it was. Saturdays could become work days to make up for missed time during the week, but Sundays were always off. Work would be done in small contingents led by enrolled men who rated as leaders and assistant leaders. Enrollees who distinguished themselves by their skills and work ethic could be promoted to a number of these rated positions, such as leaders and assistant leaders, but also a mess steward, multiple sorts of cooks, a company clerk, other sorts of more skilled positions. These positions came with perks like extra pay and relaxation of certain age and service duration requirements, but also obviously carried additional responsibilities. And some rated men stayed with 1360 for many years. We know that at least a few of them were there for pretty much the entire 7-year duration. So these leaders and assistant leaders will be responsible for directing the work of small teams of enrollees out on the grounds, with the entire effort being supervised by technical staff. And over the course of 7 years, they managed to make a huge difference all across the Arboretum. As discussed, bridges and roads were a critical contribution, particularly early on. which made for a challenging start as Company 1360 was facing a notably unpleasant winter within weeks of their arrival. In one of his regular reports, the project superintendent noted how rough that first winter was. He said weather conditions during the winter months were extremely cold with plenty of snow, although the majority of enrollees here were brought up in the south and are unaccustomed to severe winters. Only a few days were lost from field work. Personally, I was brought up in New England, and I'm still cold looking at these pictures from that first winter. But by my tally, Company 1360 constructed 6 bridges and almost 8 miles of roads over NA1's 7-year span. And although the actual infrastructure has degraded and been replaced over the intervening almost century, we absolutely still get around the Arboretum on the routes that these guys laid out. I have to say that this project has totally changed the way that my eyes see the landscape as I move around our grounds, which makes a lot of sense considering how altered the landscape is by their presence. The land preparation that they did was to 2 ends: to prepare ground for planting germplasm and to create pleasing scenery. So right from the beginning, you can see Arboretum leadership is trying to thread this needle between being a research facility that's not even open to the public, and yet also hewing to a really rather romantic landscape design aesthetic of sweeping vistas and lovely little cozy stands of trees. And the work that the men did was to all of these ends. So all in all, within a few years, this acreage is transformed. Hundreds of acres of brush is removed. Over 9.5 miles of drainage tile are buried, both along roads and in wetter areas intended for future plantings. Many tens of thousands of cubic yards of earth are excavated and graded. And as you may have caught from the pictures thus far, this is all done with very little equipment. This is labor. But it's not everything, but we'll get there. I'm jumping ahead, sorry. A number of early proposals for the Arboretum's development involved large collections of aquatic plants, actually. So to this end, Company 1360 constructed 3 ponds, Springhouse and Beach Ponds, which are both still generally largely unchanged today, and Hart Pond, which was much smaller than the other 2 and was subsumed into the larger Springhouse Run restoration project a number of years ago. And ultimately, the dreams for aquatic gardens never came to pass. Writing about a situation that I'm sure was much more amusing to me to read than it was for him to write, a future Oliver Freeman would in 1944 report that most of the hardy water lilies used to stock the lower pond were destroyed by an invasion of muskrats. This makes me laugh every time. Nowadays, their wildlife residents are among the pond's most charming attributes, as we appreciate them as proof of a functioning ecosystem. So things change. A couple of things didn't change, though. The facts that they had germplasm that they needed to take care of and keep safe. And I just realized I swapped these 2 slides, so you're going to bear with me and we are going to skip around briefly. So we're going to skip ahead to this guy, and we're going to talk about how a thing that did not change was the fact that they did not have a fence and they were still worried about vandals. It all continued to be a problem even after Company 1360 was resident at the Arboretum. And the improvements that they were making only made the issue feel more urgent to Colville and others. They were antsy to start planting, particularly as pressure to relocate plants from other Bureau plant industry locations increased, but they were still not really sufficiently confident in the safety of doing so. The fence issue came up over and over, only to be squashed by one decision maker or another. At this point, I am still not 100% confident of when all the fencing was installed, but by the time Company 1360 departed at the end of 1941, the entire property as it stood at that time was secured behind functional, albeit modest, wire fencing. The moral of this story is, if you think it seems like the Arboretum has been working on fencing projects for forever now, you are not wrong. And now let's skip back to talk about growing germplasm. These are some of the photos that were taken in the years after the camp had closed, and show some of the lasting impacts that we still see today. These are plants that are growing in facilities that were built by the enrollees. On the right here, we have one of 5 semi-buried greenhouses that were built. They're actually right near where the Washington Youth Garden is now. And those were in use until the late 70s. Those were the earliest protected areas that we had for growing young plants. They were ventilated, they were heated, they were kind of high tech. And then also on the right, we have various conifers growing in an arboretum nursery that was one of the ones that was prepared by the men. So we don't entirely know exactly which plants grew in which of the nurseries that they touched, mostly because we're not exactly sure where on the grounds their impacts explicitly were. I'm not impugning our plant recorder, our plant recorder's ability to track which nursery plants are grown in. But they're everywhere. These plants, these descendants, when you walk around, when you go to Holly Magnolia and you see those enormous, gorgeous hybrid magnolias up by themselves, those are Oliver Freeman's crosses, and those grew in one of these nurseries. When you sit under that tree, you sit under shade that exists because of this effort. So all was not in stasis back at NA1 while the men were in the field working every day. A detail of about 24 men was usually assigned to camp overhead. These included rated enrollees like the cooks and the clerks, but also regular enrollees who maintained the buildings and other facilities. In fact, whether enrollees were spending too many or too few hours on camp overhead seems to have been a constant sore spot between the Army and the technical agencies across the CCC for its lifespan. I don't have any particular reason to suspect that was a particular tension at NA1, however. What does show up when I look at our records is that there was an enormous amount of pride in NA1's tidy attractiveness on the part of pretty much everyone from enrollees through technical service through camp commanders. At the end of that first soggy winter, the project superintendent included in that same report that I cited earlier his expectation that after the seeding and sodding together with the rustic railings contemplated for next spring, a great improvement will occur around camp. And on multiple occasions throughout the years, at least as early as 36 and as late as 41, the camp was recognized as the best kept and run CCC camp in its nearly 50 camp district. This was a meaningful and much coveted recognition. Enrollees really tended to the camp. They tended to the grounds, they planted flowers, they decorated the insides of the buildings. It was really a homey place to spend time. It was not dour, it was not austere, it was not a military barracks at all. The camps located in DC and its immediate environs were under far more scrutiny than the average camp, since they were so easy for CCC leadership, congressmen, and the like to visit. And NA1 acquitted itself admirably for the distinguished visitors that it hosted over the years. At 4 o'clock, the workday ended. So most of the enrollees' evenings and weekend time was theirs to do with as they chose. They pursued all sorts of recreation, from physical to intellectual, and many also took advantage of the CCC's broad-ranging educational programs. When you look at the leisure time activities, you're reminded really profoundly that these were kids. They're more, give or take, 18 to 23 years old. There's 200 of them, they're living together. There's a definite dorm vibe to the whole thing. And when you put a few hundred young men together, it's not that surprising that sports are a priority. As was the case at most CCC camps, enrollees were allowed to construct athletic facilities of their choice. NA1 featured an outdoor boxing ring and a combined handball-basketball court, both built within its first year of existence. And at some point, these were joined by a baseball diamond. Boxing, baseball, softball, and basketball were all popular, and the company regularly participated in competitions with other camps and other local sports teams in high schools. Their record was never particularly impressive, but participation seems to have always been fairly high. What sport was most active varied over the years, depending on the company's composition. Early on, it was boxing. One of the first enrollees seems to have been a semi-professional boxer, and he coached the club, and it was pretty active for a while. In the later years, attention seems to have swung towards baseball, volleyball, and basketball, depending on the season. Enrollees also had opportunities to pursue artistic endeavors. Unfortunately, neither of the photos on this slide is from Company 1360. There were a few enrollees whose records indicate that they were very interested in art, but I've sadly never come across any documentation of their efforts. But there were some really amazing artwork coming out of CCC camps across the country. And I wanted to just share a couple quick examples here, because I feel like seeing these creations of the human mind is a great reminder that the people in our history books don't realize they're in our history books, right? From their perspective, these guys aren't unemployed, uneducated laborers. Each of them was the main character in his own life, and their lives were much richer than backsloping and sodding. Before I move on, it seems that where the men of 1360 really did shine in the arts area is music. Playing instruments, singing, they did it all. Enrollee record after enrollee record notes how much they enjoyed music. The records we retain show a company full of musical talent, or at the very least, musical enthusiasm. But there must have been some talent too, because starting in 1937, both of the camp's two singing quartets had a weekly gig broadcasting on a radio station, WJSV, every Saturday morning. I have tried to find this recording, believe me, I have tried. But I just think it's really wonderful to imagine their voices just going out over the airwaves, 9 a.m. every Saturday for years. I really wonder what they sang. So what else did they do? What else didn't they do? There were enrollee organized clubs for almost all sorts of topics, including my personal favorite, the Current Events Club. I have only the most fragmentary information about it from a various couple point snapshots in time over the years. But one thing I know is that their inaugural meeting was an exploration of the then ongoing Spanish Civil War, which I love. These clubs would have met in the recreation hall. I don't think anyone who's ever lived in a college dorm would struggle to imagine a bunch of young guys sitting around in a room like this, drinking soda, because there was no alcohol at camp, and having snacks and refining their opinions on the topics of the day. Again, it's just a little glimmer, right, of these men's lives and identities outside of the 40 hours that they spent working every day. Over the CCC's 9-year existence, education was given increasing emphasis. In every camp, the Army employed a civilian educational advisor. In Black companies like 1360, the advisor himself was also Black. The role of assistant educational advisor was held by a rated enrolled man who would also help teach and counsel the men. NA1 had a couple of educational advisors over the years, but the longest tenured was William Q. Bland, who arrived at some point in 1937 and stayed with the company for the duration. From everything I've seen, Bland threw himself into his work and was incredibly invested in the achievements of his pupils. His involvement pops up in all sorts of places, and the picture that emerges is of a really dedicated educator. The educational facilities were quite nice at NA1. Initially, classes were held in the recreation building, but at some point in the first few years, a very large dedicated educational building is constructed. In addition to the library, reading room, and classes in the educational building, there were also freestanding workshops where enrollees could develop their technical skills in subjects such as engine repair and carpentry. Also to note, the library that was in the educational building was unattached to classes. It was just a lending library. It stocked periodicals, popular novels, in addition to more into drier texts, and the periodical content was regularly refreshed, and all enrollees had access to the library whenever they wanted. Army officers, technical service staff, teachers from the Works Progress Administration, even enrollees with particular subjects or advanced education offered training on all sorts of subjects. These ranged from remedial reading for illiterate men to job and technical skills to night classes at the local high schools. What the camp would offer varied depending on the strengths of the educational advisor and the needs of the particular enrollees at that time. From my not at all statistical sampling of 1360s enrollee records, carpentry and truck driving seem to be among the more popular vocational subjects. Elementary classes like English and arithmetic also show up again and again. A fair number also took typing. This tracks with what we know about the men's education levels. According to the CCC's own numbers, the average enrollee had about an 8th grade education level. I'd wager that the average among the 1360 records that I've examined is more like 5th or 6th grade, although there is the occasional high school graduate for sure. So there was a lot of ground to catch up on for a lot of these guys. And some of the men took full advantage. They seem to have taken every class they could, while others seem to have never taken as much time as to ever visit the library. People are people, right? In general, though, the educational program was a boon to enrollees and a tool for advancement after life in the CCC. Men parlayed the skills they learned and honed at the camps into job offers and increased earning potential. Although enrollees signed up for 6-month stints, accepting employment was always a reason for immediate honorable discharge from the Corps, with transportation provided to where you needed to be next. And men were encouraged to use the leave that they earned to job hunt. So the story of Company 1360 and Camp NA1 ends rather abruptly on December 15th, 1941. They hadn't seen it coming, and they weren't the only people who didn't see anything coming in December of 1941. But the CCC itself was starting to lose steam by this point as World War II is heating up and the war industry is providing jobs that are more lucrative than remaining in the Corps. And then you have the day that will live in infamy, right? December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor's bombed, the US is drawn into the war, and within a week, Camp NA1 has been claimed by the Army as an anti-aircraft artillery installation to protect the capital. Although Arboretum activities would continue at a reduced pace throughout the war years, Company 1360's involvement was concluded. The company was reassigned to a land reclamation project in Maryland. After the war ended, the buildings came back to us. A number of them we retained for a number of years, the camp buildings. We repurposed some of the barracks, for instance, as offices. And then we also used a lot of the purpose-built buildings for a very long time. This photograph that's on this slide here shows the camp pretty much as it existed when it was closed. The group of buildings that's here, so this is the camp itself. This building right here is the education building. And down here you see all of the buildings that they built for the Arboretum that belonged to us and that stayed with us. These little fellows right down here are 2 of the eventually 5 semi-buried greenhouses. So the youth garden would be right over here if we could see that bar on this side. So we're going to put down Company 1360's story for now, because I want to talk to you a little bit about the process of finding all of this information. It was challenging. There is no central place where all of this lives. And I've had a lot of fun over the last 2 odd years just being up to my elbows in archival sources and piecing things together. And it's this thrill of a hunt that anybody who is familiar with archival research understands when you just land on something that really stings. I started out with the National Agricultural Library, which holds all of the Arboretum's archival materials, just to kind of get oriented to see what we knew already. And then from there, branched out in all sorts of directions. A couple of places were particularly helpful. The People's Archive, which is part of the MLK Library, part of the DC Public Library System. It's DC's local history archive, was really helpful in helping figure out exactly where the camp was, finding old atlases, real estate atlases, and just getting oriented to the whole story. The Archive Center at the Smithsonian's Museum of American History was a huge treasure trove. They have a collection donated by the National Association of Civilian Conservation Corps alumni, which means the contents are very dependent on what people preserve. These are non-governmental records. These are things that people who were in the CCC kept as souvenirs and then donated. So it's kind of a mishmash, but it did provide one of my earliest real cool finds. And then finally, the National Archives was a huge source for me, both at College Park and also out in St. Louis, where the National Personnel Records Center is, which maintains all of the enrollees' records on microfilm. So I want to just kind of leave most of this. I'd love if people have particular questions about the process of the research to throw those in the Q&A, because I could take this in 1,000 directions. So I want to make sure to hit the points that folks think are interesting. So I just want to highlight just a few things that were the really special finds that I made, and then we'll wrap this section up. So the first one is this I got at the National Museum of American History at their Archive Center. This is the third core area 1937 official annual. This was one of my first sets of names. Finding this enabled me to then access their records. And I used this list as a basis for the research that I would do later in St. Louis to pull records, these names and hometowns. And this was the first time, opening this book was like the first time that I saw their faces looking back at me. And it was really cool. This was a really, really great find. A very cool one that I didn't talk about earlier is lots of CCC camps had newspapers. They were enrollee produced, enrollee written. They were done in not on the clock. And I spent a long time wondering if Company 1360 even had one. And a few months ago, I got my hands on these microfiche cards, and we did have one. We had two. First, we had the lantern, and then we had the 1360 broadcast. I have about 8, I think, issues of these. They were monthly publications, mostly from the 36 and 37, my copies come. And I'm currently in the process of cleaning up these images so that we can post them online so that folks can actually flip through. This is gold. This is so cool to see how the men talked about their own lives, how they reported their own sports scores, how they talked about the Spanish Civil War. This is where they are in their own words. And this has been an extraordinary resource, both for information and just kind of for my heart, you know? And then finally, the last cool thing, you'll notice there's a trend. These are my 3 favorite things that I found, and they're all about the guys. The National Archives at St. Louis, like I said, hold all of the Civilian Conservation Corps enrollee records. Unfortunately, however, they hold them on microfiche or microfilm in these rolls. And they are organized alphabetically. And so if you've got a John Green or something, you open up the G's and you start going. It is a very, very laborious process. I spent 4 days working every second that I was allowed in there. Like, I didn't eat, I didn't leave the room. I was in that reading room and I was there, and I managed to get just under 200 records in 4 days, located and scanned. And from this, this is what has helped us understand where the men come from, what their backgrounds were, what their education levels were like, what their stories really were. And I'm using this right now as part of the exhibit that's coming. There'll be a online component in addition to this, the signage. And one of those things is going to be a story map where you can click around and you can see, you can click on the little icons and learn a guy's story, see where he's from, see what his name was, see what his family was like. You know, and that these were real people, right? These were not just numbers on government reports. And that's been the really great joy of this project, is returning these men and their stories to the world. So I just want to thank a couple of people as I wrap this up. Dr. Olson, the director of the Arboretum, whose instigation this project even came to be, my colleague Kathleen Emerson Dell, Dr. Ramon Jordan, who is my supervisor and also who funded my trip to St. Louis, without which I think the entire beating heart of this project would be missing. Dr. Jeffrey Stein, a researcher, a phone member, and a mentor and friend. And then obviously the Friends of the National Arboretum for supporting both the work and getting it out. And with that, let's chat.
All right, Julia, thank you so much. So great. Appreciate all the time you've spent gathering this information and putting together the presentation for us today. We have got some questions, and we'll get to those right now. And if anyone else has any questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get to them in a minute. First question is, why do you think it's taken so long to tell this story?
That's a good question. I think it's a number of things. I think that our story is not like, it's not unique, right? I think that there were CCC companies all over the country. This was a 9-year program. There's like hardly a public area that in the country that they haven't touched in some way, and none of that story is preserved. I think that there wasn't really an interest in preserving or celebrating like the intricate details of a work relief program. And I also think that we were kind of impacted by the gap with the war happening. And there was kind of this span between when the men were here and then when the Arboretum really took off in the 50s. And so like it just kind of fell in the cracks. I don't think that there was anything intentional about any of it. I think it just kind of fell away, you know, and I'm really excited that it's coming back now, at least.
And thanks to you for that. Okay, question has been posed. Are there any members of the CCC group still alive and in the area?
Question. I have not found any alive enrollees from our camp. Again, most of our records, I only have about 200 names. And actually I have more names. But most of our guys were born between like 1908 to like 1920. So they are no longer with us. I have occasionally looked for descendants, because all of our guys were, or almost all of our guys were from local families, originally, or resident locally. A lot of them had been born further south. And it's hard. It's a little, I haven't really found it yet, but I know they're around there. I'm hoping that this effort will help connect them, will help them realize that we're invested in this and looking for this. So.
Also, someone wanted to know if any of these CCC members ended up working for the Arboretum later in their life and careers.
I do not believe so. But again, I'm not certain. A lot of these men would have first probably gone to the war, frankly. It was not uncommon. I don't know. I don't want to oversell things. It happened that men would find work with the technical services for which they worked. But I don't think that was like ubiquitous or anything. And I don't have any knowledge of it happening with us now.
Okay.
And
all right, last call for questions. Anybody have any other questions for Julia today? We'll give everybody just one more moment, but I do want to thank everybody for coming on and participating in our digging in today, and a special thanks to Julia for all the time and effort putting this presentation together, and her research on this important time in the Arboretum's history. And again, we hope you will come out on November the 9th for the event unveiling the signage. Again, it's on Saturday, November 9th at 11 o'clock at the Arboretum, and photo members are invited. Would ask you to keep an eye out for our next digging in, which will happen on Tuesday, December the 3rd. This is our annual directors conversation. So we'll be talking with Dr. Richard Olson about the Arboretum and the work over the past year. Certainly ask you to keep out for details and photo fill notes as we move forward as well. And if you have not signed up for photo fill notes, you'll see that link right there. You can always sign up through that link. Also want to remind you about the garlic planting party and bulb sale on this Saturday. We'll have the members social at 10 o'clock, and then the full event will start at 11. And please know, we're going to try to figure out additional opportunities to give members benefits, do some social events, social hours, things like that for you, and give you special benefits for registration for events popping up as well. So again, keep an eye out for all those opportunities, and we hope to see you out at the Arboretum soon. I see that we have a special guest with their hand up, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Richard Olson, Director of the Arboretum, who has joined us today and would like to say a couple of words. So Dr. Olson, off to you, sir.
yes, thank you, Craven. I do want to point out there was a question in the chat, Julia. I think it was Ann. Someone was trying to get a question in there. Oh, you did that. Okay, good. So I apologize. I'm having a camera issue here, and I joined late from a meeting. So I just want to really thank Julia for taking this idea on and tackling this. This has been not quite all consuming for 18 months or more. And there's been questions about timing and why, and if not now, when. It's been nearly 100 years. This represents more than 10% of our history, actually longer, considering their impact. And it is odd that it's never been celebrated and discussed. And I would say it's a nexus of it kind of goes back to in Washington, D.C. in 2017-18, helped me staff when we hosted APGA and the American Public Garden Association. The theme was on the strength of diversity, and diversity grows gardens. And so we gave a talk. I gave a talk on flowering cherries in the research program there. And that was sort of the first dig into this notion of we celebrate diversity of plants, but we've never been celebrating diversity of our staff and their contributions. And I believe you probably maybe touched on this, Julia, but when you look at those CCC camps, those were some of our original buildings. And the first African-American botanist ever hired by the USDA was Roland Jefferson. And he was employed, and his office was in one of those buildings. That also speaks to whether they were ever hired, and you have to get into the history of this country and desegregation of the federal government after World War II. There was bouts and spits before that, but that's why Roland Jefferson was hired, for instance. Was the early initiatives. So this was just a history that I don't understand why we never got to it, but it adds to the sense, certainly the authenticity of the place. And you can't tell the National Arboretum story without it. So thank you, Julia, for delving in. I know this was right up your alley in terms of the history and interpretation. So I just wanted to say that because I was late, but thank you, Julia, for everything. And thank you, Bona, for hosting this first of the first of several announcements over this project and effort. So thank you.
There you go. Thank you very much, Dr. Olson. And again, thanks to Julia for joining us today and sharing her important work. And many thanks to all our phono members and our Arboretum colleagues for joining us today too. Good group to have together and hear about this important work. And again, we hope to see you at the next Digging In, but also want to see you out of the Arboretum. Come on out. It's a beautiful weekend going to be this for our events, the garlic planting party and bulb sale. So we hope to see you there, but if not, some other time. But hope everybody has a great afternoon, and many thanks for your support of Friends of the National Arboretum and the National Arboretum. Thank you so much.